Today is Easter Monday in the Orthodox world, and I should say that as an Orthodox Christian, I will be celebrating Easter this evening, tonight, and tomorrow. And that means that I will not be making a video tomorrow. May I take this opportunity in the meantime to wish all Orthodox Christians, people who practice the Orthodox Christianity and who are celebrating Easter now, may I take this opportunity to wish you all a very happy Easter, a very good Pascha. Well, after these words about Pascha, one finds oneself obliged again to return to the topic of the war in Ukraine. And over the last few hours, we've had a cascade of news, more news about the fighting in Bakhmut. This long grinding battle that has been going on for several months now, in which Ukraine has committed a large part of its army in defense and has suffered very heavy losses, but where it's now becoming increasingly clear that the Russians are on the brink now, very much on the brink of capturing this town. And in fact, today, the Russian Ministry of Defense, its spokesman, has provided us with information about further progress by the Wagner Group in Bakhmut itself. And the report, which comes from TASS, this is the TASS report that I'm reading, assault units of the Wagner private military company have occupied two neighborhoods in the northern and southern suburbs of Artyomovsk. Russian Defense Ministry spokesman Lieutenant General Igor Konashenkov reported on Saturday. The remaining Ukrainian troops have been deliberately destroying city infrastructure facilities and residential blocks in Artyomovsk, he means Bakhmut, of course, upon retreat to slow down the advance of our troops. Now, Konashenkov, the Russian Ministry of Defense, are not telling us where these two suburbs are located. But I'm going to make a guess that the northern one is in some way connected to the village of Khromovo, which is very nearby, Bakhmut, and which sits astride the road, the northern spur of the road from Chasov Yar. So I think that it is most probably in that area where this further advance by the Wagner Group has taken place. I would add, in addition, that it's not been particularly common up to this point for the Russian Ministry of Defense to highlight Wagner organization advances in Bakhmut. That they're now doing so is interesting, and it perhaps also reflects the fact that the Russian regular military are now much more actively involved in the battle than they were before. Now, I can illustrate that firstly by the acceptance by all parties that Russian paratroopers, in other words, troops of the regular Russian military, are now defending the flanks of the Wagner forces as they concentrate on clearing Bakhmut itself. And as I discussed yesterday, it seems that the assault on Ivanivska, this village to the southwest of Bakhmut, which sits astride another of the roads, spurs of the road from Chasov Yar, that is now being carried out by paratroopers. But there have been two rather tantalizing reports which I've seen, which suggest that there might actually be regular army troops from the regular Russian army, perhaps actively involved in the fighting in Bakhmut itself and performing now even more aggressive supporting roles in this battle. Firstly, I've seen a film of what is indisputably a T-90M tank operating in Bakhmut. Now, this is the most advanced tank, operational tank, in the Russian army. There's increasing numbers of them appearing on in the Ukrainian battlefields. There's even a French film, apparently, of Russian reservists training in the use of these T-90M tanks. As far as I know, the Wagner organization does not operate T-90M tanks. Now, if that is correct, then the presence of this tank in Bakhmut itself and its presence there is indisputable, and the fact that it is a T-90M is also indisputable. Anyway, then the presence of this tank in Bakhmut would appear to confirm that armoured units of the Russian regular army are physically present in Bakhmut, lending fire support to the Wagner organization assault troops. Now, I say that Wagner does have tanks of its own. I've seen them in operation, but I'm not aware and have not heard up till now that they operate T-90Ms. If they do, by the way, if the Russian military have provided them with T-90M tanks, then that is an interesting sign of the strong backing that Wagner is getting from some parts of the Russian military and political leadership, which perhaps puts in some perspective some of the arguments that have taken place between Prigozhin and the Russian General Staff in the recent past. But anyway, I think this is most likely a regular Russian army tank, and as I said, if that is correct, then its presence confirms the presence of the regular Russian army in Bakhmut. Anyway, that's one perhaps slightly speculative piece of analysis. If people want to push back on it, they're very welcome to do so. There is perhaps something else which is in some ways even more interesting, and for Ukraine, perhaps even more ominous. Now, there's been now multiple reports from all sorts of people, from Brian Beletic, from myself, from others, about the fact that the Russian Air Force is now taking a much more aggressive role in the conflict than it has until recently, and that we've had lots of reports now of Russian fighter bombers, Sukhoi fighter bombers, big, powerful aircraft like the Sukhoi 30, the Sukhoi 34, and the Sukhoi 35, operating over the Ukrainian battlefields, launching large, precision-guided glide bombs against Ukrainian targets, causing enormous devastation in their attacks on some of these targets. In fact, I've heard that one particular airstrike that took place yesterday, apparently in the Slavyansk area, involved up to 10 bombs, 10 of these precision-guided bombs, which would suggest a very powerful airstrike indeed. There is another film, by the way, of a Ukrainian column, which included armoured vehicles, being attacked by a Russian aircraft, apparently a Sukhoi 34, and there's a huge explosion near this particular armoured column, and reports suggest that much of the column was destroyed, with, I suppose, people being killed and equipment damaged or destroyed. Apparently that didn't involve a bomb, a glided bomb. That involved a Kh-59 tactical missile, which is one of the sort of big missiles that the Russian Air Force, tactical short-range missiles with which the Russian Air Force is equipped. Well, the Russian Ministry of Defense has been reporting for some time that the Russian Air Force has been conducting airstrikes around Bakhmut. Now, I have assumed that these were airstrikes being carried out by Russian ground attack aircraft. To be precise, the Sukhoi 25, which is a ground attack aircraft rather like the American A-10 Thunderbolt. In other words, it's subsonic, it's used to, flies close to the ground, it provides direct support for ground troops, it doesn't carry big, heavy bombs. And it has been actively used in support of troops in the Ukrainian battlefields and also attacks by helicopters as well. Well, it seems there are some reports now that suggest that some of these airstrikes, at least, have actually been the work carried out by much more powerful aircraft like the Sukhoi 34s and Sukhoi 35s, and that they do use some of these bigger precision-guided bombs. Whilst I'm on the topic of these big precision-guided bombs, I've seen a video on the website of Simplicius the Thinker, which shows the Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu touring a factory somewhere, Russian factory somewhere, not sure exactly where, but anyway, he's looking at bombs, aircraft bombs that are now being mass-produced, and there is the 1,500 kilo bombs, which have been converted into converted into glide bombs with precision guidance. So there were some of those there, but there were much bigger bombs. There were some that were 3,000 kilos, 3 tons, 3-ton bombs. And there was one picture of apparently a freshly produced 9-ton bomb, 9,000 kilo bomb. I'm not sure that these are precision-guided bombs, and I'm not sure that they're going to be used as glide bombs. Perhaps they are. But if they are converted into bombs in that way, or even if they're just dropped as gravity bombs on a target, then the effect of one of these things, a 9-ton bomb falling on a target, would be absolutely devastating. I mean, it would destroy most structures, or so I would have thought, including bunkers. A 9-ton bomb falling on a bunker, I would have thought, would do colossal damage. But of course, and coming back to something that I talked about often in the past, a 9-ton bomb falling on a bridge, include even these massive bridges across the Dnieper that the Soviet Union built, a 9-ton bomb would surely do massive damage to a bridge. It would almost certainly destroy that bridge, make it inoperable. It's something on a totally different scale from those strikes on the Antonovsky Bridge in Kherson region that Ukraine carried out with its HIMARS rockets, which did cumulatively, over time, a certain degree of damage, but which never ultimately breached the integrity of that bridge. A 9-ton bomb falling on any bridge, I would have thought would, well, perhaps not completely destroy the bridge, but which would certainly make it unusable and would break it in all kinds of critical ways. So I'm just saying that. I'm not certain that the Russians intend to use these bombs. I'm not certain that they intend to use these bombs against these bridges. But it seems an obvious target to me. And if they are not intending to use these bombs, why are they making them? Anyway, that's something I wanted to say. The regular Russian military seems to be active in Bakhmut, and they do seem to be pushing, helping the Wagner organization to push forward aggressively in Bakhmut and to capture increasing amounts of ground in Bakhmut, and I would have thought that by now the area, the urban area of Bakhmut, still under Ukrainian control, must be very small indeed. My impression is that the Russian tactic in Bakhmut is to end the battle, to break the battle down, to push the Ukrainians out, and to catch any fleeing Ukrainian troops trying to escape Bakhmut, to try to catch them in the crossfire. Anyway, no less a person than Yevgeny Prigozhin has now provided us with an interesting account of what he sees as the purpose of the Battle of Bakhmut. And he's written an extraordinarily long essay, quite well written actually, much of it in his usual punchy style. I'm going to read some extracts from it. He says that Wagner continues to grind the Ukrainian army down in Bakhmut. Zelensky, these are Prigozhin's words, continues to send more and more units into this maelstrom, which is destroying the best of his remaining soldiers and mercenaries. Why is he so stubborn on the question of Bakhmut? Why has he proved so incapable of behaving rationally, even after I taunted him with the prospects of his imminent failure on 20th December? This deadly dance between Zelensky and me has been going on for 4 months. Perhaps the truth is that we both enjoy it, even though there is no climax to satisfy us yet. That's a typical example of Prigozhin's style. He's certainly not a modest man, to put it mildly, and he can be rather coarse sometimes in some of his words. But anyway, he then goes on to say this: Bakhmut's strategic importance is relatively small. It is close to Seversk, Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, Konstantinovka, Druzhkova, and Chasov Yar, all included in the so-called Donbass Ring and forming a fortified area. Bakhmut is an important part of this fortified area, but the capture of Bakhmut will not ensure rapid victory over Ukraine, or clear the road to the Dnieper, or even guarantee the capture of Donbass. So why is Prigozhin himself telling us that Bakhmut is lacking in strategic importance, even as he admits that it is an important part of the so-called Donbass Ring, the fortified area that Ukraine must hold if it is to retain any part of Donbass? Well, the answer is, of course, that he's taunting Zelensky again, and that's clear from his previous paragraph. He's saying to Zelensky, look, you're acting irrationally, you're continuing to send your troops to fight in Bakhmut, even though it makes no sense for you to do so, even though, as you yourself claim, there's all sorts of places which you can defend, continue to hold and defend, and that's why he's saying that. So he's taunting Zelensky. He's telling Zelensky, you're behaving irrationally, you're sending all your soldiers to their deaths, even though this isn't actually such an important place. And then further down, he says that from a Russian point of view, this is excellent. This is exactly what Russia needs. It benefits massively from the fact that the Battle of Bakhmut continues. That as a result of this battle, Ukraine is continuing to lose the best part of its army. At the same time, the long Battle of Bakhmut is extremely beneficial to the Russian troops because they have already squeezed out a large chunk of the territory of Ukraine in 2022. If the special operation remains within these borders, plus or minus a couple of terms of kilometers, then this will solve many problems for the Russian forces. Bakhmut makes it possible for the army to gather strength, occupy advantageous defense lines, deal with internal problems, and prepare mobilized and fully armed men to meet any number of counter-attacking forces. And then he goes on to say that as any middle-level commander knows, that's presumably he's referring to himself, if you have created tension for the enemy in some place and have a sufficient number of reserves, then you need to make a maneuver and strike nearby where the enemy is not ready and it will break. The most logical step for the Ukrainian military would have been to pull back from Bakhmut and attack our flanks to attempt to break through our defense. However, from Chasiv Yar, more and more columns of equipment stream towards Bakhmut every day. Every day, Ukrainian soldiers die by the hundreds before reaching the front line, strewing the road of death and the surrounding fields with thousands of corpses and hundreds of burnt armoured vehicles. Well, I think he only exaggerates slightly. I have seen pictures of what he calls the road of death, and I'm afraid he's right. I think that that is exactly what is happening, that Ukraine has sacrificed an inordinate amount of men and machines trying to hold on to Bakhmut. Whether the option of a counterattack like the kind he described on the flanks was ever realistic is questionable. But anyway, they have sacrificed large numbers of their men trying to hold on to Bakhmut. And he talks about that too. He says the top leadership of Ukraine endlessly argues about the need to retain Bakhmut. They are trying to erect the city as a sacred symbol, but they constantly change their minds. In the morning, they deny its sacredness. In the evening, they decide to retreat. The next morning, thousands of soldiers are thrown in again, and so on indefinitely. And then he discusses the state of the Ukrainian army. He says the Ukrainian army has gathered a substantial number of soldiers, about 200,000 combatants who have undergone 2 or 3 months of training and coordination, are ready to play their part. The amounts of weapons and ammunition is enough for these 200,000 men to go on the offensive in various directions. And he goes on to say that the Ukrainians are ready to go on the offensive, but, and these again his words, the announced offensive is continuously being postponed, first on December 20th, then on January 1st, then at the end of January, then on February 24th, then on April 3rd to 5th, and now on April 15th. The Ukrainian army is in the area of concentration. They're ready and willing to move forward, but as they say, a donkey standing in the shade will not work in the sun. If Ukraine doesn't go on the offensive in the near future, they will gradually begin to lose their combat potential. Anyway, now I've read out his last words because he's finally clarified what he means by the 200,000 men that he talks about. There's been times when he sort of come close to suggesting that that is the force Ukraine has gathered in and around Bakhmut. It is clear that he is in fact referring to the entirety of the combat force of the Ukrainian army. Its numbers roughly 200,000 men. And as we've discussed in previous programs, it seems that something like 30,000 of these troops are trying to hold out in and around Bakhmut. There's probably other forces deployed elsewhere in various parts of the line of contact. It's out of these 200,000 men that Ukraine is trying to find a force to launch its counteroffensive, its much talked about, much debated counteroffensive. And I'm now going to say that I have now had an opportunity since I came to London to read more about it, more about the state of the Ukrainian military as it prepares for this counteroffensive, and about the overall condition of the Ukrainian military on the eve of this counteroffensive, or perhaps I shouldn't say quite on the eve of this counteroffensive. Maybe I should say more precisely, more accurately, at the beginning of March. And I stress the beginning of March because this information is taken largely from the leaks, the Pentagon Papers leaks, and we now have, I think, a fairly clear idea from these leaks about what the state of the Ukrainian military was. Now, was at the beginning of March as they begin to prepare for this conflict. And there's been some really interesting discussions, and two very interesting discussions about this, one by Big Serge and the other by Stephen Bryan. And rather than trawl through the documents themselves, I'm going to go to those two really very insightful commentators. So let's start with Stephen Bryan. Now, he's provided a breakdown of the Ukrainian brigades. 12 Ukrainian brigades are going to be committed, apparently, to this offensive, which most likely will happen in Zaporozhye region. Of these 12 brigades, 9 are going to be equipped by NATO forces. 3 have to be equipped by Ukraine itself. And he gives a breakdown of these brigades, the equipment of these brigades, drawn from information provided by these Pentagon documents, though he's actually taken this at second hand from Simplicius the Thinker. I'm going to say quickly that this information is in accord with what I've seen. Now, point that comes through is that these 9 brigades, the 9 brigades that NATO is equipping, are going to be very thinly equipped indeed. They have a lack of armour, low amount of armour is being spread out across 9 brigades, and that's probably going to be a problem. That's certainly going to be a problem, and the equipment levels of these brigades is actually very low. But that's only part of the problem, because as he says himself, these brigades are going to be made up of a gaggle of dissimilar equipment, which it will not be easy to maintain, with field repairs being next to impossible. This is a point, by the way, that Brian Belletic has also been saying. And he also says that there's a limited amount of artillery being provided. He says that the US has supplied 155mm howitzers, mostly with high explosive shells. He says Ukraine has fired off nearly 1 million of these 155mm shells, a huge amount. He says that according to one of the documents he's read, there are no more shells in the pipeline coming now in any significant quantities, whilst some additional thousands of shells may be found. Given the huge rate of expenditure by the Ukrainian army, it is hard to see how the 155mm artillery will help very much in the planned offensive. And he then goes on to say that there's also problems with the HIMARS system. The same story holds for the HIMARS. The critical ammunition for HIMARS in Ukraine is called the Guided Multiple Launch Rocket System, which has a range of between 15 to 70 kilometers. Ukraine has already fired 9,612 of these rockets, each rocket costing around $160,000. According to the Pentagon documents, there are no more of these rockets in the supply line. And that's, again, I suspect, something of an exaggeration, but anyway. And he then finishes by saying that Ukrainian brigades may also not be at full strength, and the number of yellow armband or elite experienced troops is probably low. Many of those who will be thrown into the fight are new soldiers marked by green armbands. And then coming back to Bakhmut and what's going on there, he says the large number of forces bottled up in Bakhmut, and he says 10,000 to 15,000, and that means that clearly relates to the forces inside Bakhmut itself at the time of his writing of this article, not, as I said, the additional forces in the environs, and elsewhere, and he refers to Avdiivka, Vuhledar, creates a twofold problem for Ukraine, whether to relieve these forces before they are destroyed or to carry on in late spring with an offensive, leaving the existing forces to try and hold their ground. Russia is making steady, slow gains in the Bakhmut and Avdiivka battles, but not in Vuhledar. That might change, mind you, in Vuhledar. Should the Russians break out of the battles along the line of contact in Donbass and push westwards, there is not much to stop them. That would force Ukraine either to divide its currently assembled counteroffensive brigades or to turn them completely to stopping Russia from reaching the Dnieper River and threatening Kiev. Well, that's from Stephen Bryan. Now, there is a much bleaker, but perhaps complementary assessment from Big Serge. And the point that Big Serge has made, and I've now seen that confirmed, and the one which perhaps highlights the utterly critical situation for Ukraine, is that I previously said that, I'd said a few weeks ago that the claims that Ukraine was firing around 5,000 to 6,000 rounds of ammunition a day was perhaps was wrong. That in fact my understanding was that the average of shells that Ukraine's artillery was firing on any particular day has now fallen to 3,000 rounds a day. Well, that might have been wrong, because Big Serge, and I've seen this confirmed, I've seen this in other reports too, says that the leaked documents reveal just how acute the shell shortage is. Ukraine's usage rate is very low right now. The report, and I think he's referring to a report from early March, claims only 1,104 shells had been expended in the previous 24 hours. Even more alarming for Ukraine is the note that they have only 9,788 shells on hand. Now, they're down their reserves, their stocks of shells, is down to around 10,000 shells. And they're only firing around 1,000 a day, according to this report. Now, it's not as bad as that. Ukraine gets shells probably every day from the West, and probably the numbers of shells goes up and down as more shells arrive, and we're not going to get into a situation where Ukraine has no shells at all. But this is still a rather shocking figure, that they're down to such small numbers of shells being fired. At least that was the position as of the beginning of March, or so it seems. And I'm going to suggest that this is the fundamental reason why the offensive has had to be postponed, because clearly the United States, the European Union, have been trying desperately to find more shells for Ukraine. And the European Union had a plan to supply Ukraine with 1 million shells, 1,155mm shells, but various support reports now suggest that that particular plan failed. So that's where the loan of 500,000, 500,000 155mm shells from South Korea probably comes from. We now have probably a amount of 500,000 shells, which over the course of the next few weeks will be sent to Ukraine. Probably not these South Korean shells, but American shells held in reserve in US stocks, which can now be released as these South Korean shells take their place. Now that sounds impressive, but we're starting from a position where Ukraine has had, to all intents and purposes, very few shells indeed. 9,788 shells on hand on one particular day. In other words, in terms of artillery, Ukraine has been running on empty, and has probably been doing so, and is probably doing so, has been doing so for some time, and appears to be doing so still. Now, these 500,000 shells, it sounds a lot, but bear in mind that Ukraine's offensives of the autumn, the Kharkiv and Kherson counteroffensive, continued for roughly, I guess, about 100 days. If you have 500,000 shells and you're using those at a steady rate over the course of your offensive, that translates to just 5,000 shells a day. The Russians are continuing to fire around 20,000 shells a day. That's on a routine day. And on heavy days, they can apparently fire a lot more shells than that. I've seen totals of 40 to 60,000 shells a day fired by the Russians being suggested. And we've had an article now in the British magazine, The Spectator. It's just come out today, in fact, which gives a sense of how devastating that is. And the person who has written this is, or rather, this is based on an interview with a British soldier who is now volunteered to fight in Ukraine. His name is Perryman, and he was Christopher Perryman, and he'd fought in Iraq with the Royal Regiment of Fusiliers. He's apparently never managed to adapt himself to civilian life, and he gives, in this article, which has appeared in The Spectator is the British, but perhaps the most important British political magazine. This article gives an astonishing picture of the kind of battle that that Ukraine is now fighting, and of the devastating effect of the Russian artillery. So let's see what he has to say. First of all, Perryman says that he has yet to come face to face with a real foot soldier, a real Russian soldier. The Russians keep their distance, and so far, the closest he's got to seeing one was a brief, rustling presence in some bushes a few hundred meters away, gone before he could train his rifle on it. Now, just bear that in mind, because Ukraine claims to be inflicting these enormous losses on the Russians, but the Russians don't come close. We've had this discussed in fighting in Bakhmut. There was those earlier reports in the Kiev Independent. For the record, Perryman is not fighting in Bakhmut. He appears to be fighting somewhere in the islands in the Dnieper, close to Kherson region, perhaps in Kherson region. He's not actually fighting in Bakhmut, but he never actually encounters Russians. He's never actually encountered Russians himself. What he's having to deal with all the time are Russian artillery. And he then goes on to say, any Ukrainian units setting foot on the islands, that's to say the islands in the Dnieper River, attract constant artillery fire directed in by nosy Russian drones, not noisy, nosy. In other words, they're there all the time. They're keeping a track of what's going on, that buzz overhead like giant marsh mosquitoes. Their artillery crews are pretty bloody good, says Perryman. Iraq does not compare to this. It is far more intense. And he says, because it's marsh, you can't dig trenches to hide in from the artillery. The Russians know that the only place we can hide is in the houses, and that if they smash them up, there's nowhere else to go. On Perryman's first stint, a Russian shell landed just 10 feet from him and two comrades, he said. Luckily, it was daytime. The boggy ground had thawed into mud, and that absorbed the impact. On a third mission, the shell hit a house in which he was sleeping, directly destroying two walls. He woke up covered in bricks, bits of cupboard and garden soil. His grab bag by his side was shredded by shrapnel, and his flak jacket resembled a dartboard, stuck with more than a dozen flechettes, tiny pieces of arrow-shaped shrapnel designed to maximize maiming injuries. My kit was completely shredded, and I should have ended up in pieces myself. Why I didn't, I have no idea. Ears ringing, he and two others withdrew to their comrade's house nearby, which also took a hit 5 minutes later, just as they got into the bunker. And he said that to many this might seem like an unrewarding soldiering experience. And he says it is typical of most of Ukraine's combat, be it on the Dnieper or in the Donbass. Soldiers can man the front lines for months without ever getting to shoot directly in at the enemy. And the reason is the Russians have no reason to come up close. They're able to shell Ukrainian troops, and they do so all the time with the kind of devastating effects that Perryman is describing. And he says that he's not been able to adapt to civilian life, and for that reason, he's going to continue fighting. And we could see again the effect that the Russian artillery has, and of course it's now supplemented by Russian bombs dropping all the time on Ukrainian positions, adding to the already devastating effect of the artillery. Anyway, let's go back to what Big Serge had to say about the state of the fighting. And he says that this is now taken from Big Serge. The most significant implication of the documents, the Pentagon 2 documents, is simple. Ukraine's combat power is significantly degraded, and in particular their mechanized units and artillery forces are in very rough shape. And he says the plan calls for a force of 12 brigades, 9 of which will be equipped by NATO and 3 internally generated by the Ukrainians. The leak does not offer insight into the 3 Ukrainian brigades, but the intended complement of the 9 NATO brigades is meticulously listed. And as I said, Stephen Bryan's article sets out what the structure is. But then Big Serge summarizes it in this way. All told, the combat power build calls for these brigades to field a total of 253 tanks, 381 infantry fighting vehicles, 480 armoured personnel carriers, and 147 artillery pieces. This implies that these will be brigades in name only, and will in fact be far under strength. Parcelling these systems out across 9 brigades will give an average strength of a mere 28 tanks per brigade, along with some 95 infantry fighting vehicles and armoured personnel carriers and 16 artillery tubes. Compare this to a US Army armoured brigade combat team, which would have almost 90 tanks and almost 200 infantry fighting vehicles and armoured personnel carriers. An American Striker Brigade, a lighter, rapidly deployable formation, would have about 300 strikers. The Ukrainian 82nd Brigade is listed to receive only 90. I would say that Stephen Bryan has explained that, in fact, the most powerful of the infantry fighting vehicles that are being supplied, which are the Bradleys, they appear to be concentrated in one particular brigade, the 47th Brigade, where they will be supported by 28 T-55S tanks from Slovakia. These are old Soviet-era tanks, heavily modernized. There's been some query as to quite why a decision was made to combine these infantry fighting vehicles with these rather old tanks. I'm not going to go there. I'm not going to speculate about that. Most of the other brigades, well, they will have some tanks, but they will also, or so it seems to me, be rather light in infantry fighting vehicles. The most powerful brigade in terms of tanks is the 33rd Brigade, which will have, by my reckoning, 32 Leopard 2 tanks, but apparently no infantry fighting vehicles at all. Rather, it will have 90 American adapted trucks, which have been made for infantry, which have been converted into infantry carriers. I'm not able to explain the logic of these deployments at all, but anyway, there we go. That's what Stephen Bryan has to say. And then going back to Big Serge, he says in combat power terms, these new brigades are going to be far under strength. Their tank strength, far from being full brigade level, amounts to less than an American armoured battalion. And I think that is true. Another key aspect of the force build document is the training schedules. This document dates from the beginning of March, at which point 5 of the 9 brigades were listed at training 0 complete, which only one of the brigades was more than halfway trained, rated at 60% complete. Despite this, 6 out of 9 were scheduled to be ready by the end of March, and the remainder by the end of April. This can only be achieved with significantly truncated training times, and these are detailed in the document. Leopard tank training, for example, is listed at only 6 weeks. Now, Brian Beletic has explained at inordinate length, great length and with great insight, that yes, you can learn how to drive a Leopard 2 in this time. You can, up to a certain point, understand how it works, but getting proper proficiency in operating this tank is simply not possible to achieve in 6 weeks. By contrast, Russian reservists currently training on tanks like the T-90M and the other tanks, they've had at least 6 months training. And of course, they're reservists, so they will already have had previous backgrounds in operating tanks, which are not dissimilar to these, to the tanks that they're going to be that they're training on. Whereas the Leopard 2 is a completely new tank for Ukraine, and the overall point is that the overall picture, this is again from Big Serge, the overall picture of Ukrainian combat power is atrocious. Those are his words. Their overall combat effectiveness faces a hard ceiling due to systemic shell shortages, and the mechanized package slated for the spring offensive is going to be far less potent than advertised. Those 9 NATO-created brigades will have the striking power equivalent of, if we're being generous, perhaps 4 genuine full-strength brigades, augmented by 3 internally generated Ukrainian brigades of dubious quality. Ukraine's hopes for an assault on the Russian land bridge to Crimea will rest on at most 400 tanks with perhaps 30,000 men. Now, he might be wrong about the manpower numbers. I think he assumes that these brigades will not be up to strength, that they'll be equipped to perhaps 2,500 men each. I would have thought it's quite likely that Ukraine will try to equip these brigades with more troops than that, so it could be considerably more than 30,000. But anyway, overall, it doesn't look like we're looking at a particularly powerful force that has been gathered in southern Ukraine to launch this offensive. And of course, as Stephen Bryan correctly pointed out, they're up against heavy Russian fortifications, fresh Russian troops dug in southern Zaporozhye region, heavily prepared, heavily equipped, properly supplied, with far more artillery cover than Ukraine has, even if once it obtains these 500,000 shells that are presumably heading in its direction. And of course, these Ukrainian forces will be operating without much in the way of air cover, or so it now seems, and with the Russian Air Force now becoming increasingly aggressive and able to carry out increasingly aggressive bombing raids. Well, it's not surprising that the offensive has apparently been delayed. The start of the offensive has apparently been delayed, though, as I said, some Russians are skeptical about this. And it's also perhaps unsurprising that there are increasing doubts on the part of many people about the prospects of this offensive. And we've had an article in Bloomberg. Ukraine's allies fear war breakthrough may not come before next year. Officials lower expectations for Ukrainian offensive in 2023. And what we're now told is that perhaps the most that Ukraine might be able to achieve, this is from Bloomberg, as a result of this offensive, is that they might be able to advance perhaps 30 kilometers, which is not enough to reach Melitopol or to break Russia's land bridge, but perhaps to put Ukrainian long-range artillery within reach of Russian supply lines heading into Crimea. What artillery? Where is this artillery that's going to provide the Ukrainians with this reach, that they can interfere with these Russian supply lines, assuming that they do advance those 30 kilometers? We've just been reading that there's very little artillery left, that there's ammunition shortages all over the place, that the United States is not going to be able to increase its shell production anytime soon, certainly not to the level that would be needed to match Ukrainian needs. There's been this delivery of 500,000 shells from South Korea. I'm assuming that all of them will be transferred, or at least an equivalent number will be transferred to Ukraine, but that might not be correct. By the way, maybe that the US military will need some of these shells for itself. I doubt that any more shells will be provided by South Korea on anything like those sort of quantities. So, where is this long-range artillery going to come from? And are the Russians supposed, assuming this advance succeeds and gains those 30 kilometers, are the Russians supposed to sit back, twiddle their thumbs, do nothing until Ukraine launches its next offensive sometime in 2024? Is it infinitely more likely that with Ukraine almost certainly having suffered enormous losses to gain these 30 kilometers of ground, and with their military heavily weakened, even further, that the Russians will seize the chance, launch their own counteroffensive, perhaps in the autumn, take back this territory, perhaps if these 30 kilometers that are captured are 30 kilometers forming some kind of a salient, maybe the Russians will act to sort of close in this salient. Or perhaps the Russians will do something else. Perhaps they'll press forward, capture Vuhledar, strike towards the Dnieper, cut off the Ukrainian troops that have advanced, or perhaps they'll do something completely different. Maybe they'll break through in the Donbass, as Stephen Bryan thinks, and advance all the way to the Dnieper, arriving opposite Dnipro, as I've said, cutting off Ukraine's shipborne trade, riverborne trade, bringing the whole of Ukraine to a point of crisis. So, again, if there are these doubts now that this offensive can achieve decisive results, why press on with it? Why continue with it at all? Thousands of people are going to die. Tens of thousands probably are going to die. We've seen tens of thousands of people dying to defend Bakhmut. Why do this? Why add to that number with this offensive? We've seen what a year of war has done to the Ukrainian army. We've heard earlier reports that all the best soldiers have already been killed or wounded and are now out of action. Big Serge makes the point that Ukraine started the war with around 800 T-64 tanks. The numbers appear to have fallen radically. And he points out that the number of T-64s that are going to be committed to this offensive is just over 40, or between 40 and 50, which suggests that numbers of T-64s, total numbers of T-64s in the Ukrainian military have fallen to critical levels. Some of them, by the way, still continue to be operated in Donbass. Every day almost, one sees pictures of T-64 tanks, Ukrainian T-64 tanks, being knocked out in Donbass. And of course, the Russians are bringing even more weapons into the battle. We're now starting to see confirmed pictures of Russian drones, strike drones. These are not just surveillance drones. These are Russian equivalents of the Predator and the Reaper and all of these things, that they're now starting to be used for the first time. There are reports that the Russians are building between 4 and 8 of these drones every month. So over time, they will gradually build up a fairly substantial number of these drones, enough certainly to operate behind Ukrainian lines, to carry out attacks on Ukrainian military formations, perhaps to do even more damage than that, who's to say. But anyway, we're getting pictures now of drones being used by the Russians. The Russian Air Force is operating. Glide bombs are being used. Apparently massive bombs are in preparation as well. Does it make any kind of tactical, humane sense to launch an offensive in these circumstances? Prigozhin says that Zelensky's decision, the Ukrainian leadership's decision to cling on to Bakhmut was irrational. And I agree. Is this offensive rational? Does it make any kind of sense? Well, based on these figures, I don't think so. Now, it could be that all these calculations are wrong. There are some people in Russian websites who believe that this is all a elaborate deception operation, that these documents aren't real, that they're all intended to give a false sense of complacency about the state of the Ukrainian military. I can't believe that. I think this is a deception operation of such sophistication that I don't think that the United States is remotely capable of it nowadays. But there we go. If these reports are correct, as I believe, then I would have thought that this Ukrainian counteroffensive, when it comes, is an act of utter folly. However, I've no doubt that it will come. I've no doubt that the president and the group around him are determined, the US president, I should say, and the group around him are determined to have their offensive. What comes next, we shall have to wait and see. Well, that's me for today. Thank you for joining me again today. More from me soon. And in the meantime, just to remind you that you can find all our programs on our various platforms: Locals, Rumble, BitChute, ODYSEE, Rockfin, and Telegram. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. Don't forget to check out our shop, where you can find all the great things there: the magic mugs, the hats, the hoodies, the t-shirts, the sweatshirts, all those great things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please tick the like button and check your subscription to this channel. Thank you for joining me again today. More from me after Easter, the Orthodox Easter. And if you're celebrating Easter, may I again wish you a very happy Easter and a good holiday.